I think a lot of people have heard about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but they often misunderstand it, and in many ways it's distorted. They think it's a narrow regional conflict. It's really far away. It doesn't matter to us. It's very messy. Might as well just leave it alone. Nothing's at stake. What I wanted to show people is what's really at stake, and that although it's geographically really far, there's a lot at stake that matters to us here. And I think what is really crucial to understand is that it's not a narrow regional conflict. It's actually nested within the wider free societies versus the jihadist movement conflict, so freedom versus tyranny. And I wanted people to see that this is a conflict that can be resolved and unpacked. The way to get to that is you need to apply rational principles, and that's the title is What Justice Demands. It's bringing in a rational conception of justice to really unpack this conflict and understand what's at stake for us in America and in the Western world and what we can do about it. So the way people think about this conflict, there's sort of two schools. One is, if you're for morality, if you're for justice, then you are swayed towards lining up with the Palestinians and supporting them. Justice for Palestine is a slogan we hear on college campuses a lot. And the counterpart to that is you see all sorts of flaws in Israel, and so you kind of line up with Israel needs to be pressured, there needs to be boycotts, sanctions, and so on. And so that's the view that if you think morality counts here, then you're kind of leaning in that way. Another view is that, well, there's nothing really at stake for us here. Moral issues don't count in this kind of conflict. And I think that, again, is the establishment view among diplomats and the sort of foreign policy community. And then a third way is another approach to the conflict is to say, well, we have moral ideas, but they come from God. And God tells us that, the realization of Israel is foretold in the Bible, and it's justified by God and biblical scripture. And my view is that those are three prevalent views on this issue. And all of them are either unprincipled or they have the wrong principles. And so I think it's right to be concerned with justice. But most people's conception of justice is really, really wrong. So my view of what it means to bring in rational principles is to say, look, justice means giving to people what they deserve and what is appropriate to a good society. So you evaluate the adversaries in the conflict by the same standards, and you say, who is living up to the kind of principles that make human life in a social setting possible? What kind of society is it that people can thrive in, that they have freedom and they have freedom of speech? That sets a standard for evaluating both Israel as a country and the Palestinian movement as a political cause. And when you have a rational standard that you can hold them both to, then you're equipped to untangle all the grievances on both sides and really evaluate them. And my view is, when you apply a rational standard, which is the principle of freedom, as you're judging both sides, you should stand with those who are for freedom, and that means all those Israelis who want a better life and live in freedom, which they have a significant amount of, and all the Palestinians who don't want to live under the Palestinian leadership, who want freedom, and anyone in the Middle East who really wants freedom. Those are the people we should be for and support and give all of our moral encouragement to. And at the same time, and in the same degree, oppose all the forces in the Middle East, including within the Palestinian movement, which are for tyranny of various kinds, whether it's authoritarian nationalism on one side of the Palestinian movement or theocracy on the other side of the Palestinian movement. And then you might know the Middle East is dense with theocracies, authoritarian regimes, dictatorships. There's just varieties of tyranny in the Middle East. And Israel stands apart for being a fundamentally free society. So applying rational principles means really having a conception of what is a good society, what kind of principles define it, and using those as a benchmark for evaluating the adversaries. So there is a widespread view of the UN as an arbiter, kind of a standard setter for what's right and wrong and how to evaluate countries. Unfortunately, the UN has this undeserved standing in many people's eyes as a legitimate organization. Now, we can quarrel about what the UN should be, whether it should exist, and what standards it has, but the reality of what the UN is today is it's morally bankrupt. And I think one telling sign of that is take Saudi Arabia, for example, where only until about a year and a half ago, women were forbidden from driving in cars. And we're in the 21st century. And women can't leave the house without a male chaperone. They can't hold various jobs. They're not allowed to choose whether to travel or not. Now, this is a society that is enforcing what you might call gender apartheid. This is Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is in effect waging war on its own, half of its population, the women. And never mind gays and how they have to live underground. Now, Saudi Arabia is a religious dictatorship, a monarchy. Saudi Arabia, at the same time, is a member in good standing within the UN. Now that should be, by itself, that's one of many scandals about the UN's lack of principle. So in my view, the UN can berate various countries, but it doesn't have any moral standing because it's not being consistent in applying any of these standards. And in fact, the more you learn about how the UN operates, the more you understand that it's dominated by, run for the benefit of, and to the advantage of really bad regimes like Saudi Arabia and Iran and Russia and China, who have influence in the voting and they game the system. And there are good countries in the UN, like the United States and Israel is in the UN, and the United Kingdom is in the UN, and many, many good countries. But in my view, they're the ones who are keeping this organization credible. So if you think, I'll give you an analogy. Suppose you're taking a road trip and you stop at a dive bar, and there's a whole bunch of biker gang people outside on their big hogs, and you go in and you think, okay, there's a bar brawl is about to break out, and you, as the tourist, are the one that is giving this dive, this den of thieves, in effect, some credibility as a place that people should go to. And I think that's sort of the counterpart to the US being a member of the UN. We're elevating it to giving it some sort of moral credibility. Israel has received more criticisms than most countries combined in the UN, and that's, I think, one more indictment of the UN, because North Korea, Syria, Saudi Arabia, Iran, all of these regimes that are actually totalitarian or dictatorial, documented. This is not controversial. They don't get the same kind of criticism. Yeah, so North Korea and Syria. I mean, Syria is actively known to have gassed its own people. It has been condemned, but nowhere nearly as badly as Israel. Now you might say, let's look at the details of what all these claims are, and you should. You should investigate. And I think what you'll find is that the UN, in effect, has disproportionate focus on Israel. And in effect, it's not being objective about evaluating Israel in that context. I think it's false. And it's not only false, it's a distortion and a cheapening of what apartheid really was as a moral evil in South Africa, which is where the term originated. It was a state policy in place for many years which treated the black population as less than full citizens. They were forbidden from doing many things. They were officially and systematically dehumanized and kept down. They didn't have their rights respected. Now, I think the application of that to Israel grossly overstates the problem that Israel has with its population of both Arab citizens and then the population of Palestinians who live under the Palestinian Authority, which is an interim state in the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip, which is run by Hamas, neither of which Israel has total control over. There are real problems. It's important to acknowledge that there are conflicts within Israel between its majority population of Jewish or Israeli people who happen to have Jewish ancestry, and the population of Arabs who have many different religions, and they're not a cohesive, it's hard to treat them as a cohesive group. So there are real challenges and frictions, and there's some bigotry and prejudice among private people, and some of it which has to be combated, and there's some official policies that are prejudicial that have to be undone. I think, and I write about this in my book, What Justice Demands. However you think of those problems, and I think they're real and they have to be dealt with, it is a far cry from the actual oppression that South Africa inflicted against its black population. And if you look in the neighborhood that Israel exists in the Middle East, in Saudi Arabia, there is a phenomenon which you should call gender apartheid, which is the suppression of women, treating them as less than full human beings. They have no real rights in the country. They're subjugated by their male family members. And that isn't restricted to Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has a very developed system of oppressing women. But you see the same sort of thing in Iran, where women are going in the streets and protesting that they have to, by law, they have to wear religious head covering, and they're protesting by taking their head coverings off, waving them in the street to say, I refuse to do this, I refuse to bow to the religious theocracy that governs this country. And they get rounded up and thrown into jail, or they get fined or beaten, because in those kinds of society, women are really not full citizens. And there's no freedom in those societies, more fundamentally. And you can see the same kind of thing, the same kind of treatment of women and also of gays in Jordan and Lebanon, even which are considered much more moderate countries. People go there on vacation, it's seen as more Western friendly. But there is sort of across the Middle East, with the exception of Israel, there is a concerted effort to subjugate whole populations of people, women in particular, gays, and then a whole host of religious minorities in those countries. And having acknowledged that Israel has its own problems in these cases, you can see that these are worlds apart in terms of the scale of the problem. So if you're going to use the term apartheid, and you have to take seriously the moral gravity of it, it more properly applies to places like Saudi Arabia with its treatment of minorities and women than it does to Israel with its problems regarding the Palestinians and the Arab population and the minority conflicts that they have. Because Israel fundamentally is a free society where you can be born to an Arab family and serve on the Supreme Court. You can be an Arab and you can serve in the military, in the police, you can be a diplomat, regardless of your religion, regardless of your ancestry. Now, it's hard to think that that is actually apartheid if you take that term seriously. So I think the overstatement of the problems in Israel between sort of the minority population and the state and the wider population, I think it both cheapens the term and overstates the problem, which there are things to solve there. There is a population of citizens within Israel who are classified as Arab. Now, Arab is itself a term that is like an umbrella. It covers people with very different political views, very different cultural backgrounds, very different religious views, and some of them are atheists. So to give you just the range, there are Arabs who are Muslim, the majority of whom are Sunni, part of the Sunni sect. There are some who are Shiite. And then there are Arabs who are not Muslims, who are Greek Orthodox, other forms of Orthodox religion, Christianity. There are Copts, which is another form of Christian belief. And then there are Baha'i, who are they originated in Persia. They're not exactly Arabs, but they're treated as sort of within this broad umbrella. And then you get people who are, like my ancestors, who originated from Iraq, who are culturally and in every respect except their religion, Arabs from Iraq. First language was Arabic. Culturally, they're very Arabic. And yet they're Jews. So you can have such a thing. They don't like being called Arabs, but they're Arab Jews. So the term Arab is very difficult to get a handle on. But the bottom line is, within Israel, there's a population of Arabs, about 21% of the population. They have full citizenship rights. And as I said, they can serve in parliament. They have their own political parties. They are in courts. A lot of them are actually a lot of them serve as lawyers. Pharmacists is a very popular profession. Now, they have more rights in Israel than they do in basically any other country in the region. Now, I want to stress that I think they have, and a lot of them would tell you they have it better than many of their relatives in other countries. There's still problems, which is worth acknowledging, that there's friction and there's all kinds of tensions within the country. But at the same time, it's important to recognize the fundamental freedoms that they do have, and that many of them will acknowledge and say, look, I might not like everything about Israel, but it's one of the best places to live in this part of the world. I can be educated, I can go to college. I'm not worried about dying because of chemical weapons from my own leadership, which is the case of what's happening in Syria. So there's a whole population within Israel who are sort of under this broad umbrella of Arab citizens who have full civil rights. They vote, they can influence the society, and they can speak out. They have the freedom of speech to a degree where if they went just across the border to Jordan, they would not have freedom of speech. If they went across the border to Lebanon, same, no freedom of speech. Or Egypt, which is now even more authoritarian than it was 10 years ago. So there is real freedom in Israel, not just for the majority who are of Jewish ancestry, but for the minority population of broadly construed Arabs. So I think it's important for people to really appreciate that. So when we talk about Israel as a basically free society, that means regardless of whether you are a believing Jew or an atheist Jew or a Buddhist Jew or a non-Jew or wherever you come from, wherever your ancestors come from. Yeah, so there is a tension in Israel between its identity as the Jewish state and its basic core principle, which is that individual lives and individual freedom matter, and that's the job of the government to protect them. There are many reasons historically, which I write about in the book. I cover some of this in the book, how it got to be this way, and it's messy. But it's important to get that although it has these conflicting elements, where there's both a significant role for religion in politics, in effect, and basic freedoms for individuals. Having said that, so Israel does have a religious character, and I think that's a problem. I think that the source of Israel's virtue lies in the fact that it has some of the inheritances of the Enlightenment view politically, which means the focus of government is to be the servant of the individual, to protect your freedom, not to be your master, which is the default in the Middle East. The basic concept politically in the Middle East is you serve the state or the ruler or the theocrats or whoever is in power over you. Whereas Israel is more in the model of Western societies, where the point of government is to preserve the freedom of individuals. Now, the religious character of Israel is a source of many tensions, one of which is the relationship with minority populations, one of which is a lot of Israelis are not religious, and many of them are atheists. And what they do is they resent the fact that religion has such a significant role. It has official backing. So there's an institution called the rabbinate, which controls marriage and death and divorce. So if you want to get married, you have to do it through the rabbinate. There is no way to have a civil wedding, which is, many people get married, so it affects many people. And a lot of Israelis hate this fact, and some of them have to go overseas, get a civil wedding, and come back, and then it's recognized. Another one is divorce. The divorce laws are governed by this religious organization that is government-sponsored. And it's not, it's religious conceptions of the role of man and women, and it's not, I think, the best way to handle things. I think Israel needs to be more secular and therefore more free, and therefore it would be more prosperous. So there's the role of religion in Israel needs to be, I think, dealt with and put aside to resolve that conflict. But one final thought on this, which is it's important whenever you think about Israel, it's sometimes characterized as it's just the Jewish theocracy. The Saudi Arabians have an official state religion, and that defines that society, which is true. That Saudi Arabia is a deeply religious society. So is Iran, and so is, in surprising ways, Jordan. But Israel has these tensions within it about freedom versus the role of religion. But again, it's orders of magnitude different, or it's materially different from what it's like to be in Saudi Arabia, because you can criticize the religious authorities, you can protest against them, you have the freedom of speech, and you don't have to follow what they say. You can leave the country. You're not a hostage of the regime, in which you can push back. And in fact, one of the surprising things is that I read a poll recently about the number of Israelis of various beliefs who are for gay marriage. It's really high, and that's where the country in that respect is, in American terms, is, quote, socially liberal. So it's a very kind of open society. And just one anecdote, there's a pride parade that happens in the city of Tel Aviv on the coast. And it's, first of all, there aren't many pride parades in the Middle East, as you might probably guess. It is one of the biggest in the world. It attracts something like 200,000 people, many of them tourists, and it's a big deal. Now, to me, that's a sign that religion has not that strong a hold on the whole of the country, and people not bowing to it. So to me, it's a complicated society. You can't say, oh, it's a counterpart to Saudi Arabia with just Jewish religion versus Islam. It's a very different society. It's much more akin to the kind of religion-state problems that we face within the United States, within the United Kingdom has similar kinds of tensions, and within France, which is a very secular society by law. And what I argue in the book is that, and not to minimize the problems within Israel, but they're more akin to those kinds of societies' problems with religion-state tensions than the total religious domination that you see elsewhere in the Middle East. The interesting thing is that some of the founding thinkers and ideologues of Israel were secularists. They were actually socialists, so they're materialists.
Who were they?
One of them was David Ben-Gurion, who ended up being the first prime minister. Another, sort of the intellectual who put in kind of in motion the whole project of Zionism, was credited with giving it, like breathing life into it, was Theodor Herzl. He himself was, I think, best described as a classical liberal. Whatever his beliefs, he thought the society should be secular. In fact, he was criticized by many of the other Zionists who said, look, your conception of what this Israeli or Jewish state would look like is not very Jewish. It's not very Jewish at all. He didn't even want to have the Jewish emblem on the flag. He wanted to have 7 stars for the 7 hours of the workday. And so there's real tensions within the Zionist intellectual movement about what do we mean by a Jewish state. Now, the society ended up reflecting many of those confusions and conflicts within this intellectual movement. And the result is that Israel does have some real separation between church and state, but not enough, in my view. It needs to be much stronger. It needs to be more clear. And religion really needs to be put in the same category as any kind of private association, which is sort of the Lockean conception of the role of religion in the state, which is religion shouldn't have any special status. It's just like, well, if you want to join the Rotary Club, join the Rotary Club. If you want to be in the chess club, be in the chess club. That being in that club doesn't give you special political status. You shouldn't have any particular influence over other people. You want to do those activities, you want to pray in your church, that's fine. But let's leave it outside of the realm of politics. So you're free to do what you do in your club or your religion, as long as it doesn't infringe the rights of other people. That's the kind of conception I think we need in Israel, but also in the US, we need more of that. Our wall of separation is still standing, but it's being chipped, it's been battered, it's got chinks in it. And I think all free societies need to be more conscious about putting religion outside of politics and separating the two really fundamentally. So one thing I try to do in the book is really unpack the conflict, tell you a bit about the background and the history, just enough so you understand it, but this is not a history book. I would break it down into several stages. So if people have any acquaintance with the Arab-Israeli conflict as it was once known, the first major part of it was the neighboring countries, Egypt in particular, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, seeking to liquidate Israel at the time of its founding. That was one of the major episodes. Around 1948 was the milestone year. And at that time, it was right to conceive of it as the Arab-Israeli conflict, because the common denominator among the enemies were Arab nations seeking to take the land and for their own enlargement and riches, in effect, just these tyrannical regimes wanting this territory. There was some lip service paid to the fate of the local population, and some talk about, well, this is for the sake of a Palestinian state, but it was not a sincere effort. This is 1948. This is the pivotal war of Israel's independence, which the Palestinian side subsequently looked back on with the term Nakba, which means catastrophe, because they lost the opportunity. And the conflict there, just in capsule form, was there was a UN resolution to separate the land that is now Israel into 2 states, one for Israel, the Jews and the Zionists, and the other for the Arab population. The Arab population and the neighboring states that supported them refused and rejected that, and they went to war. So what you have is, from about 1948 onward, there are Arab regimes they waged war to try to liquidate Israel. The next milestone is around 1967, when, again, Arab regimes are mounting and ready to mount an attack, and Israel carries out a preemptive attack on Egypt and takes care of Syrian aggression. And at that point, there's a kind of a reckoning within the Middle East, because the ideology that was fueling a lot of these Arab states was this concept of Arab nationalism. Like, the Arab peoples, whatever their origins, whatever, they're going to be one, and we're going to consolidate geographically. And this doesn't go very well for them, because in 1967 they lose on the battlefield again. So two military defeats, in effect, against this tiny little country that everyone looked upon as we could crush them. So the turning point, that what emerges after 1967 is, coming to the forefront is the Palestinian movement, which is really important for to understanding this story. the Palestinian movement I distinguish from the Palestinian people. It's a political enterprise. It has a particular ideology. And from 1967 onward, the Palestinian movement, again, it's a version of nationalism. It's not Arab nationalism for everybody in the Middle East. It's Palestinian nationalism. And it gets support from some of these Arab states who kind of step back from center stage and kind of put the Palestinians to the forefront, giving them military aid, training, weapons, places to train, resources. So they in effect become like either, you can think of them either a proxy force or mercenaries who also have their own agenda. So it's a very convoluted relationship. But that's the turning point where it becomes more the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Now the final turning point that I want to mention, just to kind of give you a handle on it, is around the middle, sort of late 1980s, early 1990s, when the Palestinian movement itself, reflecting the changes in the Middle East ideologically, becomes not primarily nationalist, but Islamist. And this is the emergence of the Islamic sort of character of the Palestinian movement, where the leading faction within the Palestinians becomes Hamas, which is the Islamic resistance movement in its full name, with support from Iran, which has kind of staked the ground for being the leader of this jihadist movement. And the goal is no longer, well, we want a Palestinian state for our national identity. It becomes, no, we need a state because we want to enforce Sharia law, and we're going to wage jihad to do it. So what you see is this progression from it being Arab nations trying to liquidate Israel, then the Palestinian nationalists saying, we need a state and we're going to liquidate Israel for that reason, to now the hostility toward Israel is, the face of it is jihadist. We need to take the territory back. So what you see is the conflict becomes not we need a Palestinian state, but we need a state in order to enforce Sharia law, and we'll wage jihad to do it. So the regional hostility towards Israel, the major conflict in the Middle East around that, goes from being nationalist to Palestinian nationalist to Islamist or jihadist. And that's why I think of the conflict, and this is part of the argument of the book, is to understand the stakes, you have to see that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict really is better understood as the Israeli-Islamist conflict, or one free society in the region versus forces that are hostile to freedom and individual rights, with the vanguard of which now are the jihadists within the Palestinian society, and then their supporters from outside. After 1967, when Israel took control of territories where there was a large Palestinian population, they enacted a policy they called open bridges, which allowed the Palestinian population to come into Israel and work. They would commute, and there was a fairly free passage. That became more constricted over time, primarily because the Palestinian movement, which was setting up itself in those areas, was starting to launch terrorist attacks. And so the more terrorist attacks there were, the more constricted the flow of people in and out of between Israel and the Palestinian territories, to the point where in the early 2000s, there was in effect a kind of terror war launched by the Palestinian movement with suicide bombings and waves of attacks. In fact, more casualties in that period, in like a 5-year period in the early 2000s, than in 25 years preceding. It was a really severe level of hostility. And at that point, there were checkpoints and really stringent controls on who can come in. Now that's changed over time. There are places where it's easier to go back and forth. One major exception now is Gaza, because Gaza is now controlled by what is an obviously hostile group, the Islamists of Hamas. And getting in and out of Gaza is very difficult, and I think for understandable reasons, because you don't want either money coming in or materials for weapons, because what the leaders of Hamas and their fellow Islamists do is use that to either burrow tunnels underground for attacking Israeli population centers or shooting rockets overhead to attack people. So there are controls over people coming back and forth. But my view of it is, it's really frustrating for both sides. I don't think the Israelis really want to be standing and doing border control and checkpoints with people. And the Palestinians lining up to go and do work in different cities, they don't want to be in the checkpoints. The fundamental blame for that, I think, lies with the Palestinian movement, which is the initiator of this aggression towards Israel on many fronts. And that, to me, is key to understanding why people standing in checkpoints and feeling hassled and it's mutually disagreeable. So the longest chapter in the book, because I think it's an important issue, is about Palestinian grievances. And I try to pick the hardest cases. I think there are 4 that I write about in length, and some sort of subordinate ones as well. I talk about the dispossession of Palestinians, the refugees, I talk about the occupation, and I talk about the denial of rights, which is a broad category. And all of these have sub grievances under them, and they're all complicated. So I try to untangle these 4 major ones. And what I'll say is that I think there is a lot of misconception around what these grievances are. And the book's project is to bring rational moral principles to help understand what these grievances are. And what I argue is the way into understanding this issue is to take not a collectivized view, so the Palestinian people as a whole have these grievances, but rather to take an individual first perspective. And this individualist view is rooted in the idea that a good society is one that protects the freedom of individuals. And so that is the principle that we're trying to apply here. This idea of freedom and individual rights this is the right framework for applying, understanding this kind of issues. So are there individuals whose lives and property and freedom have been infringed or damaged or impaired in some ways? And then if they have been, how would you redress that? So from this individual first perspective, I untangle these grievances. And I think there are some legitimate grievances. And I talk about those and I point out to how you address them. But the major ones, I think, are not legitimate. So the refugee crisis, I think, is misunderstood. It's dealt with in a collectivized view. The whole Palestinian society is aggrieved because of this. And the solutions offered for it, which is the leading one, is a wholesale return of all the refugees, plus 3 generations of descendants of refugees who themselves were born way after the conflict which triggered the refugee crisis. So we're talking about 6 times the number of people who left at the time of the war. I think those they're neither legitimate grievance in the sense of understanding who's at fault and how you address it. And I think the solution is itself a kind of a way to cause deadlock in the conflict and not really be realistic about what it means to redress a wrong here. The kinds of wrongs that I think are legitimate are actually happening right now, and I think some of them are way easier to resolve than people will admit. Some of these have to do with Palestinian landowners today and in the last few decades whose land has been expropriated by the state under various reasons, some of which I think are debatable. And maybe
that's the state of Israel.
Yes, by the state of Israel. Some of them are debatable, and you could make a good case for it. You know, like if there's a need for a military base somewhere, you know, we have things like eminent domain here, and I don't think it's a good policy, but you can understand the rationale for it. But it's something you would have to defend, so I don't think it's an obvious thing to do. But I think there have been clear-cut cases where the state of Israel has expropriated land, and that has to stop. There's no place for that. If you mean it, that people have freedom and that the individual's life and ability to follow their own judgment is paramount in your society, you can't be expropriating land. So that's one kind of problem which I think that has to stop. That's unjust. Another kind of thing is not the state acting to take over land today, but religious zealots who are Jews going to some patch of land and saying, you know, God gave us a right to this land. We don't care that you have a title deed to it, you Palestinian landowner. We're going to just squat here. We're going to just set up some caravans and motorhomes and maybe a shack or two, and we're going to declare this a settlement, totally against Israeli law, and we're going to find some local council members who are going to connive with us in this crime, and then we're going to call the police and say, well, we're a new city, we need you to protect us. Now that to me is a gross violation of the rule of law. You're violating the laws about what it means to have property in your country. You're violating the property rights of the people whose land you're squatting and in effect stealing. And then you're entangling the state in this conflict where this is not how you set up a city. You don't go and take someone's land and set up a shack on it and declare yourself a settlement. And that's a real problem that the Israeli government has. There have been major law cases gone all the way to the Supreme Court where these kinds of illegitimate, illegal, and immoral settlements are torn down by the government. They send in the military and the police and they tell these people, you have to uproot, this is not a legitimate way to to kind of create a new housing development or community. And then there's even further kinds of things, which I talk about in the book, where some of these kinds of religious zealots, what they do is they want to push Palestinians off their land. So they'll go to an olive tree grove and they'll torch it. Or they'll cut down the trees, because if you cut someone's crops down, they can't make a living, maybe they'll go away. And so again, that is a gross violation of the rights of those Palestinians who own the land, who own those olive groves or orange trees, whatever kind of crops they're dealing with. There's no place for that in a free society where you protect individual rights. That's the principle government's there to do. And the Israeli government has to be held to account for those kinds of wrongs. Now those are, I think, legitimate grievances that you should deal with. And then you have to disentangle those kinds of things from what I think of as illegitimate grievances, or grievances that are at least born of misconception or misguided thinking about what morality is about and how to apply it to individuals versus the groups. And I think that's one of the more helpful things in the book for people who are interested in this issue. So there's a massive overlap between the political, ideological enterprise called the Palestinian movement, which has been around at least 50 plus years, and the community of people who identify as Palestinians. And people like to argue whether Palestinians are real. They're real people, and this is how they think of themselves, so that's how we have to think of them. And this overlap is considerable. So the Palestinian movement has, I regard its goal to be the liquidation of the state of Israel in order to create some version of authoritarianism. Initially it was nationalist authoritarianism in the name of Palestinian nationalism, and then it became today, the other major faction within the Palestinian movement is the jihadists, so they want an Islamist society. And in both of those cases, the common factor that unites this Palestinian movement is Israel can no longer be allowed to exist. It has to be crushed, removed, whatever violence has to be inflicted, we'll do it, in order to have the society that our leaders believe needs to exist. And this is an illegitimate enterprise. I think no one has a right to, quote, self-determination if the outcome is creating a new tyranny. So I think the Palestinian movement is an illegitimate cause. It has no rights to the claims that it makes. Now, it has exerted a real influence over the population of Palestinians using thought control. It runs schools, it has all kinds of propaganda, it really tries to inculcate this ideology that we have to destroy Israel, we have to use martyrdom and give your life to the cause. And that has had a real influence on that population. But I think it's a mistake, and it's a mistake, and it's collectivized thinking. It's wrong kind of thinking to view the Palestinians as uniformly in alignment with the Palestinian movement. Now, a lot of them do support their leaders. You could see that in the vote that led to the rise of Hamas in Gaza, that they won a significant they won by a landslide in those elections. And the leadership of the Palestinian movement have long been popular and lionized as heroes. At the same time, there are people within the Palestinian territories that will tell you when it's safe to speak, because it isn't safe to speak most of the time. They don't want to live under this. They would rather move. They would either move to another country if they could, many of them can't, or they would rather move to live in Israel, because Israel's way freer. They used to have more freedom under Israel's governance than they do under the Palestinian governance that has been around for about 25 years. So I think it's important to see that those two are separate. Now, on the issue of, is the Palestinian movement really serving the interests of the Palestinian people? I think the answer to that is a clear-cut no. And in fact, I argue that the Palestinian movement is a fraud, because its whole reason for existing is we're going to avenge the wrongs done to the Palestinian people. And what they've done over the years is not avenge any actual wrongs, but in fact inflict new and worse wrongs on that population by teaching them all kinds of stories about their grievance which is not founded in fact, getting them to be hostile to a society that's actually free, which is Israel, and leading them, many of them, into armed attacks, suicide bombings, and sending their children and sons to become human bombs. Now, I don't think you can argue that the goal of creating an authoritarian society, which is what is at the core of the Palestinian movement, that goal cannot resolve any real grievance, not even partly. So there's no wrong that is righted by creating a society that oppresses everyone. And people sometimes say, look, we don't know what the Palestinian state's going to look like. Let's give them a chance. They've never had a chance to have a Palestinian state. And I argue that's completely wrong and ahistorical. They've had 4 chances at this. And in the book I describe those 4, but if you just want to get a flavor of what the Palestinian state would look like, look at parts of the West Bank where the Palestinian Authority, which is like a step towards a state, has had control. Or look at Gaza under Hamas. Both of those are deeply authoritarian regimes. There is no freedom of speech, no freedom, period. And if you want a summary, the Palestinian movement, to the extent that it's had any control of territory, any measure of self-rule, it has been trampling the rights of its own people, indoctrinating them in evil ideas that make their lives worse, and in effect, stirring up and keeping the conflict alive when it could have been resolved many, many times in the past. So in effect, the Palestinian movement isn't just harming its own people. It is the engine that keeps this conflict against Israel going, and it is the sort of the obstacle to there being any kind of serious resolution. Yeah, so the fate of Palestinian refugees is a really complicated story because some of them ended up within Israel or parts of the West Bank and Gaza. Some of them ended up in Lebanon. Some of them were in Jordan. And each country has dealt with them differently. And I think an important part of understanding this is that the Arab countries that were supporting the invasion of Israel in 1948 and 1967, and since then there were other conflicts which you can look into, and that were backing the Palestinian movement for many decades. So these regimes that were sort of putting their hat in the ring in the sense of saying, we care about you, we're on the side of the Palestinians, there's massive hypocrisy because with the partial exception of Jordan, where it allowed some of the Palestinian refugees to become citizens, naturalized, they're still considered refugees. They're not full citizens in the sense that you would be if you were born there. And in Lebanon, which was a party to a number of these conflicts, the Palestinians are kept in a really horrible condition in these refugee camps where they're not allowed to become citizens. They can't naturalize. They're not allowed to hold certain jobs. Like you can't be a lawyer or a doctor, I believe. And they're not allowed to bring into their camps all kinds of building material because there's worries about whether they would use it for weapons or something like that. So in Lebanon, there really is a kind of apartheid against them, if you want to use that term. And I don't think it's a good term to use in general, but if you want to talk about real prejudicial treatment, the Lebanese treatment of Palestinians is a real, I think, travesty that doesn't get any attention. What we do here is sort of the trigger of your question, which is the way Israel controls their access to being able to work in Israel and free movement, which are real problems for the Palestinians and the ones who want a better life. Obviously, they should be able to go and work in Israel, but it's a hard thing to untangle because you could be pretending to be going to work and have a suicide bomb strapped to you, which is a big part of why there are restrictions. So I think the treatment of the Palestinians by Arab regimes is the story that needs to be examined, and it needs to be condemned for the injustice that it involves. You should also look at the way Israel deals with them, because I think some of the treatment of Palestinian refugees in the past has not been completely fair, and I think it hasn't been that well done. But it's part of the story to think how they've been treated in all other countries. Now, looking into the history of this is really helpful. I'm just going to mention one kind of example here, which is after the major trigger of the refugees in 1948, the default solution that many people had, including the United States and many European countries, was what is the response in most other conflicts, which is resettlement. Like, let's find, okay, maybe you could go back, but it's probably, maybe you don't want to go back, but let's find another way for you to start your life somewhere else if you felt that you had to flee because of war. And resettlement was something that many Arab regimes refused point blank. They did not want to resettle. They didn't want Palestinians to come there and start a new life as citizens of those countries, in the way that refugees who come to the United States are resettled. They come, they get a chance at another life here, which is a common method of helping refugees out. And one of the calculations they made was, so long as there are Palestinian refugees who are unsettled, so long as this is a constant problem we can point the finger at Israel as the source of this suffering, and it's a moral club. Like, we can continually say Israel's causing the suffering of all these people, even though in reality, having been accomplices to the attacks on Israel, these regimes bear responsibility for helping resolve the conflict and the helping resettle the Palestinians. Now, there were times in which Israel offered to take some Palestinian refugees back, and it did small numbers. But the reason it's still an issue and why their plight pulls at the heartstrings is another factor which is important to see. There's a UN agency that is dedicated exclusively to monitoring and helping the Palestinian refugees. And like many parts of the UN, in fact, sort of characteristic of the UN, it is highly politicized. It is in effect being co-opted by the Palestinian movement, such that the definition of who counts as a refugee is distinctive to the Palestinians. It's not the way we define refugees for other conflicts. And it means that if your grandfather was a refugee, his son, wherever he was born at whatever time, will be a refugee, and his son and his son and his son, to the point where you have 3+ generations of people who are refugees who are not at all living or present at the time of the conflict. So that balloons the size of the number, so the number of people who are considered refugees. And of course, the more people you have who are refugees, the harder it is to help them with schools and resources and what are they going to do for a living. So the problem is kept alive, in part by the Arab regimes that refuse to resettle them, that refuse to help them integrate to new societies, and in part by this UN agency that is active in kind of agitating for them and inflating the number of people that are considered refugees. So it's a real calamity, but one has to re-unpack it and think morally, well, who started the conflict? Who bears responsibility here? And some responsibility might be on the side of Israel, but you can't treat it as the way it's presented by these Arab regimes, which is all the blame is on Israel. All the solution rests with Israel. They have to take all these people back. It's not clear how you would put 6+ million people into a state as small as Israel, where the population is already something like 8 million, and it's not clear that those people want to go there. Well, Lebanon had a period where it was thought of as Beirut, the capital, was sometimes called the Paris of the Mediterranean, because it was fairly westernized in terms of women weren't covered up with religious headscarves. This was sort of late 60s. This was the high point, I think, and the architecture was really developed. If you want to say what broke Lebanon, is Lebanon's civil war, which erupted in 1975, and many different countries were involved in the civil war, so it wasn't just a civil war within the community, but a big part of it was Lebanon is a country with a number of religious and kind of ethnic groups, and the civil war was a kind of grab for power and domination among those groups, into which came the Syrians, into which Israel came, because part of what happened is the Palestinian movement, the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, set up camp on the border of Israel and Lebanon, and used that as a staging ground to attack Israel, but also to try to gain control of Lebanon, because the Palestinians felt like, well, here's territory we could take over. So the war became very messy, and I think some of Israel's involvement in it is defensible, such as stopping the Palestinian Liberation Organization from launching attacks. But some of what they did and some of the partners they had, I think, are not defensible, and there's real wrongs that were committed in that case. The crux of what broke Lebanon is, I think, religious and ethnic strife within the country. That my view is the way out of that is to take more seriously the ideas of the Enlightenment, which is the individual matters, not the race or the ancestry, and to think about a government not as a tool of power, which is sort of the default view, like who gets to dominate whom, but rather an instrument of keeping people free and letting them have the freedom they need to live together. Now that's a huge accomplishment. You can't solve that or implement those ideas overnight, but to me that's the direction Lebanon needs to take, and that's the direction Israel is far down the road towards achieving. Become educated about what's really at stake here, and I argue there's a lot more at stake than a regional conflict. This is about freedom versus tyranny. And the more you understand the conflict, the more you understand the stakes, the more you can see the irrationality of American policy, and to tell our leaders, we can't do this. This is not the right way to go about it. the hallmark of American policy in the Middle East, and just zooming out wider for a moment than just the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, is refusing or turning our eyes away from the fundamental moral difference between a free society and movements and regimes that are hostile to freedom. And we treat them with no real distinction between them. So we're really good friends with Saudi Arabia, which is a tyrannical regime. And we have been good friends with Israel, but not always. Under various administrations, we've been tougher with them. But it's almost as if, well, the fact that one is free and one is tyrannical, that's not the deciding factor. It's more about calculations of what we think in the short term is to our advantage, and we think we can get better supply of oil, and all sorts of calculations that are divorced from rational moral principles. And the outcome of that is, in fact, and this is part of what I demonstrated in the book, the more our approach is divorced from morality, like we're going to just leave our moral principles at the door, try to hash out our policy without them, is you empower evil people, you empower monsters, particularly the Islamists and the tyrannical regimes like Saudi Arabia and Egypt. You make them strong, you prop them up, and you sell out free societies like Israel, freedom seekers among the Palestinians, freedom seekers all around the Middle East, the people that we should be standing for and we should be encouraging and giving moral support to. We're selling them out. They're dissidents sitting in Saudi Arabian jails for having the temerity to speak about the values that we stand for: a free society, the freedom of speech, the idea that you as an individual should be free to decide what you do with your life, whether you're a man or a woman. There are people now in jails in Egypt for the same supposed crime. We don't speak out enough about them. I mean, that we really turn a blind eye to them, and instead of doing that, we put our hand around the shoulder of those tyrants, and we give them weapons, we give them arms. We in fact empower those people, and we've actually empowered people that would be surprised to hear, I suppose, that we've put in place the conditions that have empowered jihadists in the Middle East over the last 15 years, particularly under George W. Bush. And at the same time, what have we done with Israel? We've not really had a rational policy toward them. It kind of flip-flops between more support and less supportive, but no real principled support. What I argue in the book is what's needed is a principled approach towards supporting freedom and freedom seekers. So that includes all those Israelis who are for freedom, who would like a better society, who want to keep their freedom, all the Palestinians who don't want to live under a Palestinian regime, who want a better society, want to live under freedom, and all the people in the region, whatever country they live in, who don't want to live under tyranny. Those are the ones we have been forsaking and sacrificing in effect. And to me, that is the exact opposite of what a rational policy would be for a country, our country, the United States, and all Western countries that take seriously the ideal of freedom should be advocating. So I'm passionate about having people understand the conflict, understand the stakes. If we care about freedom, progress, and human flourishing, and just the power of the free mind in society in creating values and prosperity. You see it in Israel with its concentration of startups. You see it in the United States, which is the largest economy in history. There's a correlation between being in a free society and having the ability to prosper as an individual. If we recognize that, that should color our whole view of foreign policy, and in particular our policy toward the Middle East. We should be passionate idealists for the rational principle of freedom. And to me, that is the key to unlocking this conflict. Then getting into the details of how to resolve it, there's some guidance I offer in the book, but you can't get to that end state unless you start from that principle of freedom. I think if you are a Palestinian and you want a better life, you're in a minority, and you are surrounded by people who don't share that view. There are many of them actually, according to the best polls we have that are conducted by the Palestinian research organizations, the goals of the Palestinian movements are well supported, so you're in a very small minority. Those are people who, if they speak out on Facebook saying, you know what, our president is in the 15th year of a 4-year term, which is actually true. President elected once for life, basically. You will be thrown in jail. If you're a journalist who wants to expose the massive financial corruption within the Palestinian Authority, which is the least of the kind of moral flaws of this regime. This is a regime where the economic exploitation is just a small part of the problem. If you're a journalist who does that, you're not going to live very much longer. You're going to either be beaten up, you're going to have your articles crushed because the editors are under influence from the regime, or you're just not going to be a journalist ever again. You're going to be sort of blackballed. And there are stories of newspapers, not journalists in particular, not one story, but newspapers being shut down or having their presses burnt to the ground. Or if you live in a society where the state really controls the media and controls what goes into the schools, that is a very difficult position to be in if you are advocating for freedom. So they are an endangered minority. So across the Middle East, this is a wider phenomenon, but across the Middle East, Christians are rapidly shrinking in the number of people in their population, in Iraq in particularly, and in Egypt, because they're widely persecuted by their authoritarian regimes. They're being driven out, both officially and also through vigilante violence by Islamists. And what you see in the Palestinian areas, where the Palestinians have some control over the territory, is that the Christians are really living in fear, because the population they live around, in the past, before the Islamist movement became such a widespread and powerful force, there was not an issue. Being a Christian was not something that marked you out for prejudice or persecution. But now it does. They fear to live in the streets. There are Christian butchers in Palestinian territories who sell pork, because being Christians, they can eat pork. Their Muslim neighbors don't like that, and it's not clear how long those butchers will be able to continue plying their trade, because that is not halal, that is not right. Allah forbids it. And there's this phenomenon of vigilante violence within the Palestinian territories. So I think this is a community, a minority within the Palestinians, who, whatever their political views, being the quote, the wrong religion, marks them out for persecution. Now, Christians in Israel don't face that, because in Israel there's real protection for the freedom of minorities, and protection for everybody's freedom, and they're able to thrive as a community in the way that under Palestinian authority, they're not able to do that.
And so do Muslims in Israeli society as well.
Yeah, so in Israel, one of the remarkable things is people think of Israel as a Jewish state, and it talks about itself as a Jewish state. But in fact, it doesn't matter what religion you have or no religion. You are free to conduct your life however you want. And there's one group that really, I think, tells the story here. So there's a faith called the Baha'i, and they originate in Iran, where they're severely persecuted. Their places of worship have been bulldozed. They're forbidden from owning property and going to school, and really kept down economically. And many of them have fled to the West. Now, there's a thriving Baha'i community in Israel, because they're free to practice their faith however they want. There's freedom of religion. And one of their temples is actually a tourist landmark. It's not bulldozed by the state. It's actually something that people are proud of, to say, look, we live in a society where it doesn't matter what faith you have. You can have a temple. It is beautiful, there are lovely gardens, and people flock to see it, as opposed to living in fear because of the religion that you have.